When I first saw the listing online, it felt like fate. 5 wide-open acres, rolling fields with a view of distant mountains, a modest ranch-style home that had clearly seen decades of storms, but still stood proud against the wind. The surrounding land, dotted with wildflowers and grazing deer, promised the quiet rural life I had been craving for years. After too many cramped apartments, neighbor arguments, and ever-increasing city rent, the idea of owning a piece of earth, my own little sanctuary, was irresistible. I visited the property the very next weekend. There was a slow breeze that carried the scent of pine from the forest line at the back of the property. The old fence posts leaned as though tired, but even they spoke of history, of a life lived with hard work and satisfaction. The previous owner, an elderly rancher, had passed away years earlier, and the bank now controlled the sale. There were no traces of anyone else, no neighbors peeking over fences, no noise beyond the rustling of grass. It was peaceful, uncontested, perfect. The paperwork was surprisingly smooth. No mention anywhere of shared communities or restrictions. No long list of rules dictating which color the house could be or what types of plants could grow in my yard. No absurd penalties for grass height or holiday decorations. It was a ranch outside city limits, unincorporated land, exactly what I had been searching for. With the final signature completed, the property became mine. I planned every detail of my new future. A small workshop for woodworking, a chicken coop, an orchard someday, apples, pears, maybe cherries. A life separated from the constant state of scrutiny that city living had forced upon me. A life where I could breathe. The first few weeks were bliss. I spent my mornings sipping coffee on the porch, while the sunrise painted everything gold. I patched parts of the fence, mowed around the house, discovered a small pond hidden by overgrowth. I found horseshoe prints in the dirt and imagined the rancher riding every inch of the land he once cared for. I believed I had finally escaped the world of petty oversight and needless conflict. But peace, apparently, was a luxury someone out there decided I did not deserve. It began with a letter. A thin envelope slipped into my rusty mailbox, which up until that day had only held advertisements and circulars. The return address named an entity with a title that felt oddly aggressive for a rural community: Clear Meadow Ranch Owners Association. The phrasing caught me off guard. Owners Association? There had been no mention of an HOA in my closing documents. Nothing on the listing. Not a single warning of oversight or governance. The bank had insisted the area had no active association. My real estate agent had double-checked. Even my title insurance included a statement confirming the same. I assumed it was junk mail, maybe a solicitation. So I tossed the letter into a drawer without opening it, choosing not to let anything unwanted disturb my tranquility. A few days passed before the next envelope arrived. Thicker, certified, paper demanding a signature to receive. The postal worker eyed me sympathetically, though at the time I didn't understand why. Inside the envelope was a bill, a shockingly large bill. $88,000. Due immediately. Below that number, in bold ink, were the listed charges. 10 years of unpaid dues, fees, assessments, and penalties. My heart pounded, each beat louder and more forceful than the one before. My brain scrambled to rationalize what I was reading. This was impossible. I had only owned the ranch for a month. There was no way I could owe anything beyond my mortgage and property taxes. And yet, according to this letter, I was personally responsible for more than 10 years of supposed charges. Attached was a packet of rules, dozens of pages of regulations so absurd they bordered on parody. Grass height restrictions to no more than 2 inches. No livestock allowed without written approval. Mandatory monthly community meetings, despite the fact that I had not yet seen another soul for miles. Architectural control for any exterior change, including paint color, fencing, or tree planting. even specific conditions for the type and number of vehicles allowed on site. It was everything I had tried to avoid, everything I thought I had successfully escaped. And the fees, the ever-growing penalties, hundreds of dollars added monthly, late fees compounding, threats of liens and foreclosure if unpaid. The tone of the letter was chillingly hostile. It spoke not like a neighborly association, but like a debt collector with a personal vendetta. They claimed the HOA was reactivated only 5 years ago and had legally assumed responsibility for all properties in a large radius, retroactively imposing dues that had supposedly existed since the ranch's original development. Decades earlier, the previous owner's lack of payment became my burden, they argued, transferred with the deed. My fingers shook as I reread those paragraphs. No part of it made sense. No history of an association existed in public records. The ranch was clearly built for independence, not communal oversight. If an HOA had existed, it had long turned to dust. How could strangers suddenly demand nearly $100,000 for rules I never agreed to? I needed answers. I drove the long dirt road toward the nearest paved street, hoping I might find someone who knew more. Yet every property I passed looked just like mine. Isolated structures scattered across land with no sign of uniformity. Some meticulously maintained, others collapsing into the soil. Nothing about this area remotely resembled a regulated neighborhood. Eventually, I reached a set of newly installed wooden posts supporting a large metal sign. Welcome to Clear Meadow Ranch Community, a proud HOA neighborhood. The sign looked fresh, artificially modern, out of place. Beyond the sign, a tidy white house sat near the road. Fresh flowers lined the porch. A shiny SUV gleamed in the driveway, a sharp contrast to the aged character of most ranch properties nearby. Movement by a window caught my attention. Curtains were pulled abruptly shut, as though the watcher wanted to avoid being seen. I could feel something lurking beneath the surface of this place, something territorial, something hungry. When I returned home, the ranch no longer radiated the peaceful optimism it once had. The sun still warmed the field, but the brightness seemed dulled. The air still carried the scent of pine, yet now tinged with the metallic taste of anxiety. That evening, another car crept slowly down my driveway. A dark sedan driven by a stern-faced man who studied my house like a predator sizing up prey. He didn't step out, didn't wave, just watched, then reversed and disappeared into the fading daylight, leaving tire marks etched into the gravel as a silent warning. It became clear that this was more than a clerical mistake or paperwork. Confusion. Someone wanted money. Someone wanted control. And they believed they had found their next victim. I stood alone under the darkening sky, holding the letter that threatened to destroy the dream I had just begun to build. The wind whispered through the grass, no longer comforting, but cold. I realized then, moving here wasn't an escape from conflict. It was the beginning of a battle. One I never asked for, one I couldn't afford to lose. The night after receiving the threatening letter was restless. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were plagued by images of faceless individuals hammering foreclosure signs into my yard. The property that once felt like freedom now loomed with the weight of uncertainty. I awoke before dawn, still fully clothed, the envelope resting like a curse on the kitchen table. There were two clear options: panic or investigate. I chose the latter. The morning sunlight gave me a temporary surge of confidence as I sorted through all the documents from the purchase. Closing statements, tax assessments, title insurance, property disclosures, page after page confirming a total absence of anything resembling an HOA. I even called my title insurance representative and left a message detailing the situation. Surely, if a massive financial encumbrance existed, they would have caught it. Surely, someone beyond me was responsible for this insanity. But security fades quickly when predatory forces move faster than clarity. By late morning, the third letter arrived. No postage, no stamp, just hand-delivered, meaning someone had trespassed onto my land to place it directly in the mailbox. It was a final delinquent notice, though the word final felt more like a threat than a chronological descriptor. It stated that my non-responsiveness was considered willful defiance, and unless I paid the full $88,000 within 30 days, the association would place a lien on my home and begin foreclosure proceedings. The implication was unavoidable. They believed they owned me now. At the bottom of the page was a name typed in bold and oversized font. Marjorie Caldwell, President, Clear Meadow Ranch Owners Association, followed by a phone number, followed by a demand to schedule a compliance evaluation of the property. Before panic could regain its foothold, I remembered the house near the large community sign, the house with the surveillance-like curtains and the aggressively pristine exterior. A house that stood out not because it belonged, but because it was manufactured to dominate the landscape. It was time to meet the self-appointed ruler of this barren kingdom. The drive was short, but every mile felt like I was crossing further into enemy territory. I parked in front of the immaculate White House. The lawn was suspiciously perfect, as if each blade of grass took orders. There wasn't a leaf out of place. Not a single weed dared rise in rebellion. A brass plaque by the front door proudly displayed the HOA's emblem, a stylized meadow wrapped in a ring of chain-like laurel leaves. No movement, no welcome, only the tense silence of a house built on intimidation. I approached the door. It swung open before I could knock, as though someone had been watching my every step. The woman who appeared was neither warm nor patient. She radiated the type of authority that required submission, not respect. She held a clipboard, and without letting me inside, insisted she would conduct the compliance walk immediately, because the association had already recorded multiple violations on my property. Violations. Plural. Already recorded. I followed her reluctantly as she marched into my space, as if my land belonged to her. She pointed her pen toward the faded paint on my porch, scrawling notes as though documenting a crime scene. She listed the rust on the mailbox. She scrutinized the height of my grass, barely half an inch longer than the ridiculous rule allowed. She criticized the fence repairs I had done, claiming everything must be pre-approved by her architectural committee. Every minor imperfection became evidence to justify their tyranny. But the worst blow wasn't the petty list of demands. It came when she spoke, her voice sharp, unyielding, declaring that livestock was strictly prohibited and that the previous owners' horses had been grandfathered in under long expired. Permission forms? The ranch. My ranch was apparently never supposed to be a ranch at all. It was supposed to be part of their emerging community vision. Her clipboard turned, pages with chilling efficiency, as she tallied fines associated with each of the so-called violations. Each observation of peeling paint or weathered structure translated into hundreds of dollars added to my already astronomical debt. Their trap was obvious now. Overwhelming financial pressure, ensuring compliance through fear. She paused then, as though shifting to another subject entirely, but I could sense the calculation behind her eyes. She mentioned casually that developers had shown interest in merging the land surrounding the newly rejuvenated HOA district. That my property, being so large and so close to the main road, had excellent potential for subdivision, if only someone holding enough power could authorize it. Then she said it, a statement masked as concern, but dripping with predatory intent. If the debt was too much for me to handle, the association could arrange a transfer, my property in exchange for the forgiveness of all owed dues. A fresh start, she called it. The implication was unmistakable. They wanted the land, not the money, and they expected me to surrender without a fight. She returned to her pristine fortress, leaving me alone once again among the wide fields that no longer felt free. My pulse throbbed with anger and fear in equal measure. The ranch that once promised autonomy had become a chess piece in someone else's game, a battleground in a war I never chose. But the moment I got back inside, more evidence of their constant monitoring appeared. A fresh envelope sat wedged between the door and its frame, as if placed during the short time I had been away. Inside was a printed photograph. My driveway, my porch, me standing on the phone, looking confused. Taken without permission, taken from an angle that could only come from the road or a vehicle parked nearby, perhaps the same dark sedan that had watched me days earlier. Below the photo, "You are being monitored for compliance." It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was surveillance. They were waiting for me to break. But instead of collapsing under the weight of their pressure, something hardened inside me. I needed help and leverage. I needed to uncover everything about this suspiciously reactivated HOA, its legality, its history, its loopholes. And more importantly, I needed proof that what they were doing wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. So I returned to my kitchen table, surrounded by documents, letters, and photographs that would become my arsenal. I opened my laptop and typed the name Clear Meadow Ranch Owners Association into the search bar. Very little came up. Too little. A tiny, recently created website. Sparse public records. No archived documents predating the last few years. It was as though this organization had materialized out of nowhere and seized authority through intimidation alone. But buried deep in the county records, I found a name attached to the articles of reformation filed 5 years earlier. Marjorie Caldwell. Her name. Her signature. Her design. She wasn't just the HOA president. She was the architect of this entire scheme. And, from the look of it, several homeowners had either given up their land or vanished from the area entirely after she arrived. As the sun dropped behind the horizon and shadows stretched across my once peaceful property, I realized I was facing more than an unreasonable. No way, I was up against a hostile takeover masquerading as community rule. The kind of conquest that never expected resistance, but they had underestimated me. I wasn't about to let them steal what I had worked my entire life to build, not without a fight that would make them regret choosing me as their target. Satiti, battle for my ranch had only just begun. The next morning, I awoke with a purpose that cut through every trace of lingering fear. I hadn't run to the countryside to trade one form of suffocating authority for another. This ranch was not a privilege granted by an overreaching committee. It was a right I had paid for with every dollar and every dream I owned. If this HOA wanted a war, they would soon discover they had picked the wrong landowner. I started with the county offices. The drive into town was long, but the rural quiet gave me time to gather my thoughts. Fields blurred past the windows, each acre a reminder of what I was fighting to keep. I rehearsed my questions. I needed clarity on history, what this place was before Marjorie. Caldwell arrived and twisted it into her personal empire. The clerk at the county recorder's office wasn't surprised when I asked about Clear Meadow Ranch Owners Association. The look that crossed her face, something between exasperation and pity, told me this wasn't the first time someone had come seeking answers about that organization. She pulled several thin folders from a back shelf, far fewer than I expected from a neighborhood supposedly established decades ago. The earliest record was nearly 30 years old, a proposed community development that never progressed beyond basic plans. A developer had envisioned manufactured homes and orderly lots. Everything the barren ranch land was not. But the project had fallen apart before construction began. Investors backed out. The original HOA never became fully operational. It died as an idea on paper. For decades afterward, nothing. No dues, no meetings, no enforcement. Just land sold off, scattered to independent owners like the rancher before me. Then, about 5 years ago, a new filing. Articles of reinstatement. The HOA had legally resurrected itself, citing obscure clauses from the original development plans, and signed at the bottom, just as I had found online, Marjorie Caldwell. She listed herself as president, treasurer, and secretary. Complete control. The reinstatement documentation was incomplete. Missing required supporting signatures from existing homeowners. It should have been invalid, yet somehow it had slipped through unnoticed. That alone was suspicious. But what followed was worse. A pattern of property forfeitures scattered across the records. A handful of parcels had changed hands rapidly since the HOA's rebirth. First fined into massive debt, then sold at suspiciously low prices to an entity sharing a mailing address with the HOA's office. The owners appeared to vanish afterward, leaving no forwarding details. One by one, land was being swallowed up. My ranch was next on her map. I copied every document and left. The office with a file thick enough to prove wrongdoing, but still lacking the smoking gun that would crush her claims completely. I needed to talk to those who had once lived here and fled. The first address I found belonged to an elderly couple who had owned land just north of my property, at least until last year. Their new residence was a modest rental closer to town. The man who answered the door looked worn down in a way that told an entire story before he even spoke. His eyes carried a lifetime of work, yet his posture hinted at defeat. No speaking, no details exchanged. But he handed me a cardboard box, documents, letters, photographs, everything connected to his former home. Inside were snapshots of a humble but well-kept ranch, slowly falling into disrepair as notices and fines accumulated. The HOA had attacked every detail. A shed lacking a permit, animals that didn't conform to community aesthetics, a tractor visible from the road, even the pattern of their roof shingles. Over 2 years, the couple had accrued more than $120,000 in fines and forced legal fees. Unable to keep up, they had been pressured into selling, though selling was generous. They walked away with barely enough money to keep themselves afloat. Their land now belonged to the HOA, repurposed into what looked like staged community amenities, on paper only. In reality, it remained barren and unused. The couple had included newspaper clippings, too, local stories long forgotten. One described a developer's proposal to build upscale vacation properties on this land. Another mentioned new highway expansion strategies that would greatly increase the value of property near the main road, including my acreage, a development opportunity. Disguised as a rural community revival, the motive became clear. This wasn't about enforcing rules. This was a takeover, one property at a time. The HOA wasn't failing, it was succeeding, and ruthlessly. I drove next to an abandoned house that once belonged to a younger family. The windows were boarded, and a faded public auction notice still clung to the door. Their story was likely the same as the couple's. A slow bleed of penalties until escape became the only option. As I stood in that ghostly silence, staring at what remained of their dream, I noticed something chilling. A set of cameras mounted discreetly on light posts along the road, their lenses angled toward every driveway. This land wasn't overseen, it was surveilled. I hurried back to my ranch, the folder of evidence clutched tightly like a lifeline. But as I turned into my driveway, my heart dropped. My mailbox was gone. Not vandalized, removed entirely. In its place was a stake in the ground holding a laminated notice. Unapproved mail receptacle removed for community safety. Fine, $350 replacement required with HOA, a approved model below that. Another sheet of paper was sealed in plastic, to protect it from the breeze. Second notice. Foreclosure proceedings, pending, 30 days had suddenly become 25. I felt heat rise beneath my skin, anger and fear fusing into something sharper, something determined. They wanted me overwhelmed. They wanted me isolated. They wanted me desperate. But what they didn't understand was that every tactic they used only strengthened my resolve. Inside the house, I spread the documents across the dining table. Everything lined up more clearly now. A predatory land grab under the mask of an HOA. A monopoly being built on the ruins of stolen homes. And at the center of the web, smiling behind a polished facade, was Marjorie Caldwell. I printed copies of every file and placed them into 3 separate folders. One for my attorney, one for the State Regulatory Board, and one for the County Sheriff's Department. Even if this battle escalated, I would no longer be fighting blind. As I sat down to gather my next steps, a sound broke the quiet, crunching gravel under slow-moving tires. I hurried to the porch, my pulse pounding. The dark sedan returned, windows blackened, engine humming like a predator's growl. It lingered there, unmoving, as if waiting for a sign of collapse. But I refused to give them the satisfaction. The vehicle eventually rolled away, turning toward the president's perfect home like a shadow returning to its master. I stepped back inside, locking the door, though a lock suddenly felt like flimsy protection. Night fell with the unsettling knowledge that my ranch was being watched, my every action recorded, catalogued, weaponized. Still, I took comfort in what I had achieved today. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had the truth on my side. The HOA may have believed they controlled the land, and the owners, and the narrative. But now, I held the evidence that could break their entire operation. Morning arrived, but the unease from the previous night clung to me like dense fog. The ranch, once a place of solace, now felt like a fortress under siege. Every creak of timber, every rustle of brush outside the window carried the suggestion of surveillance. Yet in that discomfort, something fierce had awakened. Conviction. I had evidence now. Real proof. And evidence is a weapon. Before dawn had fully broken, I drove into town again. My first stop was the office of a real estate attorney. Someone who might be able to dismantle the legal framework this predatory HOA was hiding behind. The receptionist's initial politeness quickly shifted when I mentioned the organization's name. It was not the first time they had heard of Clear Meadow Ranch Owners Association, but they immediately warned that taking the case might be complicated. The HOA had a reputation for dragging out litigation, burying opponents in endless filings and appeals. But I wasn't powerless anymore. I laid the documents on the desk and pointed to the most damning sections. The incomplete reinstatement filings, the forced land acquisitions, the missing homeowner approvals, the lack of notification in any property transfers or closings. It took only a few minutes before the attorney's skepticism became interest, and then full attention. He explained that, on the surface, the HOA appeared legitimate. They had been filing appropriate paperwork in recent years and presenting themselves as a recognized association. But legality depends on origin and authority, and this group's origin was fractured, possibly void entirely. The attorney agreed. There were grounds for a major legal challenge. He drafted letters of dispute and cease and desist notices to the HOA, demanding immediate suspension of all fines, threats, and surveillance while the matter was under review. Copies of those letters were sent to the county and state oversight boards as, well, the first blow in this war had been delivered. But aggressors rarely retreat quietly. When I returned to my ranch, later that afternoon, chaos awaited me. The road leading to my driveway was lined with orange cones and a large sign. Road work. Community Improvement Project. HOA approved construction. Construction equipment churned dirt and dust into the air. Workers I didn't recognize stood around lazily, their vehicles blocking access. The foreman claimed the road was now part of a federally funded community enhancement initiative set in motion by the HOA. He informed me that I needed to park farther away and walk, as property owners were not cleared for vehicle access through active improvement zones. I stared at the machinery ripping apart the only direct entry to my home. It wasn't a project, it was a barricade. I parked along the main road and trudged through churned earth until I reached my driveway, boots sinking into freshly torn mud. When I reached the front yard, I stopped cold. There, towering above the fence line, stood a metal pole with a mounted security camera, angled directly at my porch. A small sign on the pole read, "Community Safety Monitoring System. HOA installation. Tampering will result in prosecution." They weren't hiding their surveillance anymore. Walking through the house, I made note of every new intrusion. A flyer shoved under the door announced a mandatory compliance conference scheduled at the HOA headquarters in 3 days. Attendance compulsory. Absence punishable by fine. The words echoed with contempt. They truly believed I was under their control. But at the far end of the living room, something new caught my attention. A shadow that should not have been there. A shape resting near the hallway wall. A dead dove. A pristine white dove, neck twisted unnaturally. Feathers scattered as though someone had thrown the lifeless bird against the house. Its presence held chilling symbolism, as if a message had been delivered without ink or paper. Peace is dead here. The fear hit first, sharp and cold, but then the anger swallowed it whole. They wanted to break me psychologically, but intimidation only sharpened my focus. I documented everything. Photographs of the construction blocking the road, the surveillance camera installation, the dead bird, and the notices. Each new violation would strengthen my legal case and further expose their harassment. Still, I knew legal filings alone wouldn't protect me. Not entirely, so I looked for neighbors, potential allies, people who had resisted, or still could. At the far edge of the subdivision was a small farmhouse, its paint peeling and its flagpole bare. A pickup truck sat sunken in overgrown grass. The property looked neglected, but not abandoned. I approached cautiously, scanning the surroundings. A curtain shifted inside. Someone was watching. I raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a silent plea for recognition. The door cracked open just enough for eyes to appear. They were wary eyes, tired eyes, eyes that understood. No words were exchanged, but the look was enough to convey an entire message. You're not alone here, but speaking up has consequences. The door closed again. It wasn't help, but it wasn't rejection either. The return to my ranch was quiet but tense. The sky had darkened prematurely, clouds swirling with the promise of a storm. As thunder grumbled across the plains, I double-checked every lock and drew every curtain. I continued sorting evidence late into the night, cataloging each infraction, preparing for a fight that was rapidly escalating into something dangerous. Then the phone rang, an unfamiliar number. No caller ID, the ring sliced through the silence. I hesitated before picking it up, but curiosity outweighed caution. Silence greeted me on the line. Not static, not breathing, just waiting. And then the call ended. Moments later, another sound. A slow, steady hum growing louder. I stepped to the window and peered through the smallest gap in the curtain. Headlights. The dark sedan again, idling at the end of my driveway. The stormy sky flashed lightning, briefly illuminating the figures inside. 2 shadows, watching, me not moving, not turning off the engine, just waiting out there, like sentinels of Marjorie's dominion. They stayed until the rain arrived, heavy sheets pounding the earth like war drums. Only then did the vehicle roll away, disappearing into the night. When the house finally fell silent again, I realized the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't merely a legal conflict about dues or property rights. This was a siege, an attempt to isolate and psychologically force surrender. But they had made one critical mistake. In trying to terrorize me into submission, they made me determined to expose them. The HOA had played its strongest cards early, and now I knew the full extent of their desperation. Tomorrow, I would attend that so-called compliance conference. Not because they ordered me to, but because the heart of this corruption sat there, waiting. And now, I was ready to confront the queen of their little empire herself. The storm was far from over. 3 days passed like a slow countdown toward confrontation. Sleep was fitful, meals forced. The ranch felt like a bunker caught between caution and defiance. But the stack of evidence on my table grew thicker with every hour, each new detail confirming one undeniable truth. Marjorie Caldwell's HOA was built on fraud. The morning of the mandatory compliance conference, I gathered every document, photo and printed record into a thick binder. Not as a gesture of cooperation, but as ammunition. The drive to the HOA headquarters took me along the freshly torn-up roadside, where construction equipment lay abandoned in puddles left by the storm. The mud still bore deep tire tracks. The dark sedans, I suspected, ghosts of the surveillance that had become routine. The HOA headquarters wasn't a real office. It was Marjorie's pristine white house. The lawn was too green, the porch too polished, an artificial perfection fueled by control. A folding table had been set up on the driveway, lined with clipboards and neatly arranged forms, as though bureaucracy alone validated their authority. A cluster of people stood waiting. Not neighbors, but enforcers. They wore matching polos embroidered with the HOA emblem, and each carried tablets like they were logging evidence of my existence. Marjorie herself stood in the center, clipboard in hand like a queen holding court. Her smile, tight and brittle, did not touch her eyes. She radiated certainty, convinced she had me cornered, but she had no idea how wrong she was. The moment I stepped onto her property, she began marking notes on her clipboard, no doubt documenting fabricated violations. She motioned toward a chair across from her table, demanding my compliance with unspoken authority. Instead, I placed the binder on the table and opened it with a firm, deliberate motion. The pages inside caught the light. County filings, property histories, foreclosure transfers, surveillance photos, proof of harassment. Her pen paused mid-scratch, her attention shifting from my presence to the incriminating pile of paper. My attorney had already filed the disputes that morning. Notices were legally active. The HOA's threats were documented and now part of official complaints to state regulatory agencies. I had the advantage, and she recognized it immediately. Her posture faltered just a fraction. A crack in the armor. Before she could speak, even though she never used actual conversation, only command, a firm voice arrived from behind. The sheriff's department SUV I had seen earlier now parked near the road. 2 uniformed deputies approached, water-darkened boots crunching gravel beneath them. They had copies of the same binder, delivered directly by my attorney. Marjorie turned pale beneath her layers of confidence. Letters. Deputies explained the situation with cool professionalism. This HOA was under investigation for fraudulent reactivation, illegal collections, wrongful property seizures, trespassing, surveillance violations, and harassment. All enforcement actions, every fine, every threat, were ordered to cease immediately until legal review was completed. Marjorie erupted in outrage, not with spoken argument, but with furious scribbling, as though her pen had the authority to reverse law. Her enforcers hovered uncertainly, uniforms suddenly meaningless without their leader's imagined power. Then came the final blow. One deputy handed her a summons for a court hearing. She would need to provide proof of legitimacy or face criminal penalties. Standing there in the open driveway, surrounded by the wreckage of her empire, she trembled with indignation. The sheriff informed the group that any further harassment of residents, any retaliation, would result in immediate arrest. Her eyes flicked toward me with venomous intensity. But this time, the threat held no teeth. The queen had been dethroned. But justice rarely arrives neatly wrapped. The cleanup took months. The road construction, revealed as unauthorized, was halted and dismantled. The surveillance cameras were removed. Threatening notices ceased. The remaining homeowners, previously hiding in fear, cautiously emerged as news spread. Some approached me quietly, gratitude hidden behind caution. They had lived years under Marjorie's tyranny, afraid to resist. Court didn't go easy on her. The judge called the HOA a manufactured authority supported by coercion and deception. The reinstatement filings were declared void. Every foreclosure reviewed for reversal. Several properties were ordered returned to their original owners, if the owners could still be located. Investigations uncovered a network of shell companies tied to Marjorie, all designed to absorb the stolen land. Developers were named. Deals unraveled. The scheme collapsed. Marjorie avoided jail, at least initially, but faced massive civil liability and the end of her iron grip. Her once immaculate home went up for sale. Yard overgrown within weeks when no one maintained it for her. As for the dark sedan, it vanished. No more silent threats parked at the end of the driveway. No more eyes lurking. Peace returned slowly. But it did return. The ranch changed because of what happened. The fear etched itself into the land like a memory. But there was resilience here, too. Wildflowers kept blooming. The wind still swept the fields at dusk. The horizon remained wide and unclaimed. I poured my energy back into the home. Fresh paint on the porch. Repairs made without permission slips. Chickens clucked in a coop I built myself, because livestock were always meant to roam these fields. Occasionally, I'd see the elderly couple who had lost their home, now fighting to reclaim their stolen land with renewed hope. Other families joined together to rebuild community, not an HOA, but a neighborhood shaped by respect rather than control. The abandoned house down the road saw new life, repairs funded by restitution. Children's laughter returned to the vacant spaces Marjorie once seized. One evening, as I stood outside watching the sun melt into the horizon, I realized something important. They had tried to break me by isolating me. Instead, they awakened a community. The ranch was mine and would remain so, not because of documents or mortgages, but because I refused to surrender when they pressed hardest. The battle had taken a toll, but it revealed who I was beneath the surface. Not prey, not a victim, a landowner who fought back. The wind rustled the grass gently, no longer a warning. It was peaceful again, truly peaceful. The peace of earned victory. The mailbox, my replacement mailbox, stood sturdy at the end of the driveway, unmonitored. No envelopes filled with threats, no false dues, just ordinary mail, usually quiet, sometimes hopeful. On days like that, the ranch became exactly what I had imagined when I first discovered it online. A sanctuary wide enough to hold every dream I had once feared to pursue. The HOA was gone. The debt had been wiped clean. The land was safe again. Freedom had been defended. And won. And finally, this place could be what it was always meant to be. Home.